today is that time, so I'm very thrilled. Thank you very much to be here. Before I start this presentation, I would like to acknowledge and respect that we are in Treaty 4 territory and we recognize the 4 Métis communities in this region. The title of my research was, How do high school counselors perceive their role? It can start in the parking lot. The reference to the parking lot was borrowed from one of this study's counselor participants who suggested that from the moment she drives up to the school, colleagues and students approach her in the parking lot and her day starts. There are 12 sections to this presentation which follow the order of the dissertation. These sections offer a broad scope of the entirety of the research, and I'll go rather quickly if you don't mind, and I'm sure you don't. I'm grateful to my doctoral supervisors as well as my committee for their time, attention, and expertise in relation to my doctoral journey. I've also received past supervisory support from Drs. Lyon, Ryan, and Huber. Very grateful for everyone who supported me in my journey. My external examiner was Dr. Natalie Papadouk from the University of Victoria. Very good. As Shauna already said, in June I superannuated after a 31 teaching career, 8 of which were as a full-time high school counselor. In my role of counselor, I often wondered what people had in mind when they used the term guidance counselor. I would often think to myself, well, if all you think I do is tell kids what classes to take or how to get to post-secondary, you're mistaken, because that's not my job at all. Knowing the nature of the role as I did, I wondered how the discourse could be reconceptualized to better suit a truer understanding of the role, given that its nature is clandestine and therefore hidden to those outside of the role. As I began to assemble and study the literature about the role of high school counselor, I realized that much of the American scholarship unites the role with the concept of student advocacy and frequently social justice advocacy. I saw that professional bodies which have oversight of school counselors' work had published specific advocacy guidelines or competencies which were often referenced in the literature. This included the American Counseling Association's advocacy competencies and the American School Counselor Association's national model for advocacy standards for school counselors. The Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association, formerly the Canadian Guidance and Counseling Association, provides services and membership to professional counselors, but does not promote or publish advocacy standards and competencies in the same way as the two American organizations. The Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association is an umbrella organization which has regional and special interest chapters and appears to operate in a much different way than the American Counseling Association or American School Counseling Association. Likely because in Canada our education systems are provincially regulated, and in the United States, from what I can tell, they have these umbrella associations which seem to govern the entire country. This is not to say, however, that the Canadian Counseling Association and organizations are without standards or ethics. It was specifically, though, the published advocacy competencies in Canada compared to the American literature that I was interested in discovering. This led me to wonder, are high school counselors student advocates, and if so, are their advocacy activities driven by a social justice agenda? Aside from possible activities related to how school counselors advocate for or with students, I was curious about how counselors perceive their role. My experience was that the role was complex, hidden, ambiguous, and demanding. Do other counselors feel the same? What sorts of tasks do they routinely do? What does a typical day look like for high school counselors? There are 6 issues related to the role of high school counselors which may be addressed by these research findings. 1, what specifically is the nature of the high school counselor role? 2, who determines the role of the high school counselor? 3, are high school counselors integral to student success, or are they a fringe support for curricular programs? 4, has the role of high school counselor changed in the past decades? 5, how or why do high school counselors advocate for or with students? And 6, does the current role require a reconceptualization from the past school counseling discourse? This study may be purposeful because it offers insight into how practicing high school counselors perceive their role. It also examined if or how counselors advocate for or with youth and contextualizes the term advocacy. Finally, it introduced the concept that the role of high school counselors should be reconceptualized to reflect a more accurate role definition. There were 5 research questions asked of research participants. The first 2 questions were designed to obtain demographic information about participating counselors. I wanted to ensure that I had a good sample of counselors who were various genders, ages, and at different stages of their careers. Data concerning counselors' schools was important to situate the participants within their school ecology. The 4th question was specific to the advocacy work that counselors do, if they see themselves as advocates at all, and what advocacy means to them. The 5th question was asked to obtain data in regards to how counselors perceive personal and professional challenges or risks in their practice and how they reconcile these challenges or risks. Only on rare occasions did I ask further prompts. The participants appeared to comprehend what was being asked of them, and an enormous amount of data were collected from the 5 questions. The extensive literature review in the dissertation addressed the origins of the high school counseling profession in Canada as well as the United States because of the shared history of the 2 countries. However, for the limited scope of this presentation, I would like to highlight specific milestones within the Canadian school counseling landscape. Around 1912, in Calgary, Etta St. John Wildman crusaded for in-school counseling because she felt that youth should have assistance in finding a vocation. Vocational guidance was seen to help with the complexities that came as a result of increased urban industrialization. When World War I exposed some standard industrial progress in Canada, the Canadian government gave $10 million to the provinces to establish technical education, which became part of vocational education in high schools. In Ontario, between 1921 and 1925, specific vocational guidance education was being given to teachers. World War II brought a bigger need yet for more skilled workers in industry, and as the decades advanced, so did a more formalized approach to guidance initiatives in schools. The literature review affirmed, however, a silent discourse in regards to this formalized approach for Canada's Indigenous youth who were being taught in Indian residential schools. And I very much appreciate the quote by Joanna Piskin in 2009, where she claimed in her book, Taking Back Our Spirits, Indigenous people were not constituted in the ideology of the empire. And so throughout reviewing this literature, it's absolutely silent and absent of any connection to Indigenous children at the time. In Canada, during the first part of the 20th century, teachers carried out the functions of guidance because they disseminated information. The mental testing and mental hygiene movements saw the need for trained counselors in school. Both movements were focused on the selection and sorting of students for academic or social fitness. As the decades passed, comprehensive guidance programs came as a result of the need to offer information to a wider volume and audience in schools for students. The current role of high school counselor may be seen to be ambiguous. Much of the American discourse in high school counseling specifies that there is now a trend for school counselors to be advocates for or with students, and that advocacy practices are linked with social justice advocacy. The Canadian literature on high school counselors as advocates is not as pervasive, which represents a gap in the Canadian school counseling discourse in relation to American scholarship. To what extent are high school counselors in Canada advocates for students? What does the term advocacy mean to them? And do their advocacy activities have a social justice agenda? I used 3 conceptual frameworks to design, report, and analyze this study. The first was an interpretivist approach, which was used specifically in data analysis. I also relied upon Durkheim's concept of structural functionalism. And finally, I drew upon 5 principles of grounded theory. An interpretivist inquiry embeds reality within my own interpretation. In order to draw meaning from data, my own experience was an integral factor, specifically in the exercise of coding the raw data. Although bracketing my experience and thoughts during data collection appeared to be a simple task, I interpreted this data subjectively to draw insight from it. Although this is not a narrative inquiry, it is acknowledged that the stories of counselor participants provided thick description to the findings. Durkheim's concept of structural functionalism helped me to pull into the data the notion that high school counselors were embedded in the social structure of the school and therefore players in the rituals and status quo of the larger ecology. I also drew upon 5 principles of grounded theory. The first was, I used a constant comparative analysis in collecting and analyzing data. I focused on how participants perceived and interpreted their own reality rather than search for an objective truth. Rather than entering the research with a theoretical assumption, as grounded theory might do, I drew thematic conclusions from the data. I amended the literature review as data began to unfold, and my own sense of tension in relation to the counselor role is present in the study. I'm not neutral. I used a collective case study method to design this research. A collective case study is an analytic method to discover what can be learned from a single case. Using more than one case helps a researcher to view phenomena from multiple perspectives. Case study research brings to light real-world phenomena which otherwise might be hidden. In this case, I felt that the work of high school counselors certainly was hidden. Case studies also inform the complex interactions between individuals and their environment. The research proposal specified that 12 research participants would suit the study, and 12 participants volunteered. They represented 2 urban and 1 rural school division, 10 identified as female and 2 identified as male. While an abundance of demographic information about the counselors and the schools in which they worked was collected, I was interested in the data which suggested that in some cases, one counselor served up to 500 students. The research proposal indicated that there would be a triangulation of data sources which sometimes is indicative of case study design. Semi-structured interviews would be triangulated with participant journals and job descriptions from employing school divisions. It was also indicated in the proposal in regards to that organizations information oversee the work of school counselors in both Canada and the United States to bring clarity to the gap in the discourse between the 2 countries insofar as their state and own student advocacy. The collected data took the research findings in a slightly different direction, however. I learned that only 1 school division has a job description for high school counselors, and it in itself did not yield any significant data. Participants were very reluctant to journal, and the 2 participants who did submit journal data reproduced what they had already said in the interviews. The information regarding organizations which oversee the work of school counselors appeared to also not contribute meaningful data at all, so it was removed. On the other hand, the semi-structured interviews yielded an enormous amount of data, over 81,000 words. My supervisors and I felt that this data was sufficient to represent rich findings. Authors Sim and Sharp, 1998, said that it is believed that data triangulation in case study improves validity and reliability. However, triangulation may also be redundant if it does not provide either new or meaningful data. And in relation to validity or reliability, I was more concerned about trustworthiness rather than focusing on validity or reliability. Narrative interview data were recorded verbatim, transcribed, and contextualized on a 5-column matrix. Open coding involved the reduction of data, axial coding represented the data in new ways, and selective coding developed overarching thematic codes. Coding frequencies were then used to inform thematic discoveries. The emerging theoretical perspective found by this research data is that high school counselors perceive tension in regards to their role. Embedded in this tension is one typology which encompasses 10 of the 11 emerging themes. The second typology, school counselors support students, does not embed tension and includes the 11th emergent theme. The first typology, tension inherent in counselors' roles, encompasses 10 themes. 1. Because I asked participants specifically about their role advocating for or with youth, the most prevalent emerging theme was that counselors revealed a multitude of ways they advocate for or with students. They advocate for school success. Their advocacy practices may be related to issues of social justice. They advocate for students with learning or social emotional needs, immigrant refugee students, and they teach self-advocacy skills to students. Through their advocacy work, they may experience interpersonal strain with teachers. 2, the notion of an ambiguous role definition adds to the complexity and tension in their role. They are ambiguous even about confidentiality. Unclear expectations of the role leads to ambiguity, and they are ambiguous about communicating with parents. This ambiguity is seen both as a challenge and a risk. 3, participants had the sentiment that everything gets brought to their doors. Therefore, the demands on counselors contribute to their sense of being overwhelmed. 4, a profound and salient finding is just how involved high school counselors are in the mental health issues of students. School counselors work with a high prevalence of student anxiety and depression, self-harm, and student ideation. Further, accessing community supports for mental health issues may involve weeks of waiting. So high school counselors may act outside their own bounds of competence as they try to support students who are in queue for external support. 5, counselor participants reported that communicating regularly with students' parents is regular and it's also time consuming. They realize that parents may not wish to hear what they have to say, and on occasion, counselors are verbally attacked by parents. 6, counselors reported having unpredictable days which start very early in the morning, have a multitude of meetings at lunch, and have no set time of day end. 7, counselors collaborate with other professionals within the school and with professionals in the community for the benefit of student well-being. 8, counselors also make themselves available to support teachers and may even serve as advocates for teachers. 9, counselors deal with life-threatening issues such as missing students or dealing with students who have weapons. 10, while some counselors are aware of the need for self-care, others may not be as aware or willing to acknowledge the need of self-care. There may be a reluctance to pathologize their own role-related stress. The second typology encompasses the work school counselors do that does not have embedded tension. They assist students with scholarship and post-secondary applications, deliver announcements to students, and even help students pass academically. A grounded theorist may ask, what is going on here, according to Corbin 2017? An emerging theoretical perspective, as revealed in the first and foremost prevalent typology, is that high school counselors experience tension in regards to their role. Durkheim's concept of structural functionalism provides the backdrop through which to contextualize that counselors work both for students and a social structure, which is the school division. They are asked to uphold the routines, practices, and procedures of the school or school division, even when these routines, practices, and procedures conflict with student well-being. My analysis of counselors' tension is reflected by the use of 9 conceptual complexities. 1, high school counselors function under the anachronistic title of guidance counselor. The fact that social workers in some school divisions have the title of counselor around this area in the Prairie provinces further complicates what high school counselors should be called. 2, counselors' advocacy activities may conflict with supervisors and colleagues and place them in either personal or professional stress relationships. 3, counselors are involved in the life of immigrants or refugees who may have experienced trauma. Where or how counselors receive support for their own emotional needs is questionable. 4 and 5, role ambiguity and dubious confidentiality guidelines further reflect the tension inherent in the role. 6, they are asked to be administrative relief, perhaps because they may not have teaching duties. 7 and 8, they are mental health workers for students and perhaps even their colleagues. 9, they may be the first to respond to crisis and may be placed in physical danger. Based on the findings from this research, I offer 6 recommendations. 1, that the role and title is reconceptualized into 2 separate functions, academic advisor and personal counselor. 2, because of their status as teachers first, high school counselors are governed by the Provincial Teacher Federation and its Code of Ethics. However, this code may not cover the complex nature of the counselor's role. I therefore recommend that high school counselors establish their own governing body and accompanying ethical code for the regulation and support of their profession. 3, I recommend that confidentiality guidelines receive clarity in view of the work that high school counselors do. 4, I recommend that school divisions understand counselors may need emotional support because of compassion, fatigue, or vicarious trauma. 5, that schools be more trauma-informed is also a recommendation. 6, it may be surprising to some that high school counselors are frontline crisis workers and may even be exposed to physical danger. I recommend that school stakeholders acknowledge this and put in place protocols to ensure counselors' safety. Through this research, I identified several implications for future research, which I'll summarize through 4 categories in this next series of 4 slides. 1, about the counselor role. 2, about student mental health. 3, about the paradigms of school counselors. And 4, about systemic issues. 1, high school counselors are asked to fulfill a number of tasks. I would be interested in knowing the tasks they fulfill which are not associated with counseling. While conducting the field research, I wondered if female counselors are asked by their supervisors to fulfill tasks which are not required of male counselors. Future research in this area may bring an understanding as to the subtle or apparent differences in the role of female versus male counselors. 3, it appears that those who must function both as teacher and counselor have tensions and complexities, and that has not been previously researched to any depth. About student mental health. 4, as schools in this province may receive an increase in English as an additional language learners in the years to come, research may shed light on the specific issues such as trauma for which school counselors help this specific group of students. In tandem with this concept is a question of whether or not schools in Canada are trauma informed. 5, participants for this research spoke about accessing mental health supports external to the school. How, why, and the frequency of such referrals to the community may also be a topic for further research. 6, high school counselors' experiences counseling grief-stricken students appears to be a really under-researched area. I was actually surprised how under-researched the area of grief is. About the paradigms of school counselors. 7, one of my most prevalent observations through this research was that counselors placed importance on teaching students skills within the counseling relationship. It occurred to me that counselors may see themselves as teachers rather than therapists or clinicians. How might a therapeutic or clinical paradigm differ from an educational paradigm in the process of counseling students? 8, much of the work school counselors do is reactive rather than proactive. This distinguishes individual counseling versus school-wide comprehensive guidance programs. This observation leads me to be curious about an asset versus deficit approach within the role of high school counselors. About systemic issues. 9, I would like to interrupt the assumption that the Indigenous youth tracking activity spoken by one participant is rooted in benevolence, because it appears to me that through this, Indigenous youth are surveilled differently to what non-Indigenous youth are beyond high school. And I want to explain that in the dissertation. It was a finding based on participants' experience that this particular school division, as a requirement placed on the counselor, was to give exit slips to Indigenous youth post-graduation so they can be tracked for the next 4 years, where non-Indigenous youth do not have that tracking upon them. And so at first glance, one might say, well, isn't that interesting? They obviously have great importance upon what happens to Indigenous youth post-graduation, and to track them to see if they're successful in their own post-secondary or work careers. And of course, in my mind, Foucault's research on how a society is surveilled, and particularly how some marginalized populations are surveilled, was the troubling notion in this concept. I wonder if further research might reveal the work high school counselors do specific to Indigenous youth, and whether this work either subjugates Indigenous youth or contributes to a decolonization paradigm. I assume that it may be a shocking notion to some just how much physical danger high school counselors may find themselves. 2 counselors in this study reported being in a position of dealing directly with students who had access to firearms. In conclusion, Through this research, I hope to add scholarship which attests that the role of high school counselor is embedded in tension, ambiguity, and complexity. The anachronistic term guidance counselor and the former discourse it reflects associated with vocational counseling does not suit a contemporary understanding of the role. High school counselors are critical agents in the mental, physical, and emotional well-being of students, and sometimes even their families. High school counselors are called upon to be administrators, and they also support teachers. They respond to trauma and crisis. They work with professionals external to the school for the benefit of students and their families. They're advocates for or with youth through a multitude of ways, even though through doing so, they may place themselves in conflictual relationships with colleagues and supervisors. But they are passionate about their jobs and their role in the lives of students. On a personal note, this research certainly has been a milestone for me. It was an ending, and now I hope a new beginning as well. I embraced my role as a high school counselor, which culminated in this research, and now I'm going to let go and move on. The journey is not yet done. Thank you very much. I realize I rushed through that tremendously because I'm so excited of the positions we call counseling. You know, for example, even at the Ellen Blair Cancer Center, they have counselors who are social work background, you know, and so someone who has a counseling background, it's difficult to kind of penetrate that world. I know they're skilled, I know that they've, you know, gone to school and so forth, and likely we have, you know, real overlapping training and experience. It's frustrating to me that and I cannot say all school divisions, but specifically, excuse me, for the school divisions through which my research participants were generated, that the title counselor is given to people who have a social work background. And so I believe that's one of the reasons why this old term of guidance counselor has stuck with us for so long, because nobody knows what else to call us, point A, and point B, nobody knows what we actually do. They likely think that we're guidance counseling. They likely think, if you just stop somebody, you know, discourse in public, stop somebody on 13th Avenue and say, tell me what a guidance counselor does. Well, they tell you what classes to take, they help you with your post-secondary application. If you were to say to them, well, quite frankly, they probably do at least one suicide intervention every day. You know, dealing with students who self-harm can be a 24/7 job just in itself. You know, and you start explaining the things that we actually do, and it does not fit the role of guidance counselor. So what I was frustrated with, and certainly it showed up in the data of my research participants, were the fact that we are expected to be these jacks of all trade. You know, for example, we stop a student from a potential suicide one moment, put in a safety plan, call home, call authorities, call child and youth, get the kid over to child and youth. Like, we're dealing with this high intense world of really saving lives. And then in the very next second, you know, there's a kid outside of our door. Can you help me with this post-secondary application? Can you help me with this scholarship? And quite frankly, I always felt that I was, those are the things that I'm letting down. Those are the things I'm not doing very well. You come up to me and say something like, oh, what classes, you know, kids will stop in the hallway, what classes do I need to get in the Faculty of Engineering? You know, and oh my God, you know, I was just at Child and Youth dealing with this kid, and I was just, you know, maybe had to take a kid home, and I saw that the home was, you know, unfit for the kid to live in, and there was a police escort down the way, and, you know, and so these two worlds really collide, and one has to suffer. And in my experience, it certainly was the academic and post-secondary counseling that suffered, because I was involved in crisis mode most of the time. Now, let me go farther. I'm very, very concerned, and I would love to give this presentation, or a watered-down version of it, to the school divisions, you know, maybe with their elected board, that, well, in Regina Public Schools, that they've now said to counselors, you know, because of our budget shortfall, you now have to go back in the classroom and teach one class a day. And of course, if you can get 4 of them doing that, you're saving 85, 90 grand, you know, and so that's what they've done. To me, it represents a discourse that we're still seeing as the margins of supporting the school program of teaching and learning, but we're not as important as those who teach and are involved in full-time teaching, but we're supporters of that. And my take on that would be that if the stakeholders and the educational establishment, the decision makers, knew what we really did behind that closed door, Would they think differently? Maybe not, because budget always speaks louder than anything else. But it's a curious thing to me. So, back to your question. I certainly advocate for two different roles. You know, you have that post-secondary or career counselor in some of the rural areas. That's what they do. They career counsel. And then you also have someone whose only job would be to do social, emotional, and personal counseling. Because the two, one would suffer tremendously. You know, for example, because counselors are routinely on the front line of everything, you know, it's 8:30, there's been a horrendous fight in the parking lot. We're getting all the kids coming to us, showing us social media texts that say this one's gonna, you know, punch the lights out of this one is in the bathroom trying to cut her wrist, this one, you know, and then all of a sudden you say, wait a minute, hold up, I've got to go teach. You know, and so they are going to be very, very torn. That would, to me, would be a huge area of research interest, because I could only find one little narrative from a woman in Britain about 1970-some who talks about both teaching and counseling, and it was written like, you know, well then I, you know, go and put the flower on my desk and I water the flower. Like, it was just nothing to it. And it's a very under-researched area, because these folks would feel very, very, now the families and the kids aren't going to get 20% healthier. And they didn't get 20% healthier over summer, because counselors have to be teaching 20% of their day now, correct? You know, and so that means they've got work on top of work on top of work, and crisis on top of crisis.